and trinkets. Could we have the 1803 Louisiana Purchase back? And they started laughing. So, point of that is that they instituted the horse. We brought back the concept of the horse through scientific and anthropology to demonstrate that the horse was part of the way of our life. It was here. The Spaniards, they disagreed, but as time went on, they understood what we were saying, and what it really came down to is the DNA. Most of the DNA came from the North American continent. That means us. We were there. And it showed that we had the horse already. So it's going to be our thing is really, we need to start believing in ourselves. I have a nephew who has a master's in biology. He was proud that the indigenous scientists came together with modern science and started to show that we had many of these ideas long ago. So I think it's really important to take a look at who we are. We have a lot to offer. With that, I think we're getting ready to start. I know you guys are going to be falling asleep, so Simon says stand up and shake your hands up in the air and twist around a little bit. You know, those are teaching tools of the education system long ago. I know some of you know that. The educational system long ago was presented in high anxiety. So if you got out of hand, you got hit by a ruler. That's why my nephew over here, he's been hit with the ruler so much that he doesn't think straight. Justin, they call him Shicha, his nickname. So I just wanted to let you know that's how they educated us, by using intimidation tactics. That's what they did. And it really showed through the count of Miss Buffalo, showing how many we've lost during that process. They weren't teachable, then they disappeared. If they were fighting a culture that they grew up in and an imposed culture that they had to do, and it was forced upon them, and a lot of them didn't agree. And some lost their lives. Are we ready? Are you ready? Okay, here we go. Justin said the next meeting he's going to bring steak. T-bone.
Your way to hook this up?
Okay. Is it Gado?
Yeah,
First name is
Vivian.
Vivian. Excuse me. Our next speaker will be Vivian Delgado. While she's getting ready, there was an interesting point. We need to start recognizing the Teoshpai that we come from. So when you speak, kind of reference that.
Oh, well, there I am, but I still need to log in, don't I? Can you hear me? Yeah. Mitakiase, mitakiape, matosentewi iuha, he shantewashtet, ichichia pia, lila wapila tanka, oglala oyate. I want to really thank everybody here, the tribe, for sponsoring this. I want to thank you for the sacred pipe that we have here, the sacred songs that we heard, the food, also this good feeling that we have when we come together to pray, to sing. It's a form of love. And, you know, there were two people that spoke earlier before me the last couple of days that talked about unity. We get unity from love, but we don't talk about love because we think of love between a man and a woman, but really it's a love of the pipe. It's the love of the earth. It's the love that we have for each other, or we should have for each other. That's what's going to unify us more than anything else in this troubled times. So those of you who don't know me, you might know me in English. My name is Vivian Gado, and I used to live at Standing Rock. And my teachers there were all treaty people. And that's when I first started doing treaty work back in 1980. I want to say their names because they had a big influence on my life. Only one of them is still alive. Her name is Mary Louise Defender Wilson. And I learned with her brother, Dan Defender. I learned from Joe Walker, Reginald Bird Horse, Grandpa David Spotted Horse, his son Gordon Spotted Horse, Philomena One Feather, Margaret Trummel, and Perry Many Wounds. Some of you probably might know them. They were very strong. They were part of the Black Hills Treaty Alliance, and they also had the Landowners Association at Standing Rock. So when I used to go to meetings with them, it was always about, I was very super young back then, it was always about taking notes for them. And they would always explain to me, they knew I didn't understand everything. I couldn't because I didn't have the experience. So I thought that was really interesting because today I'm still taking notes. Now I'm taking them for Phil 2 ago and some of this treaty work that I do. I also work as a consultant with Andrea Carmen, and you got to hear from her yesterday from the International Indian Treaty Council. So I've been doing this work for a while. I wanted to jump right into my PowerPoint and talk about the structure, I guess, of some of how we work with treaties. But I thought about other things too. When I was getting this instruction from the older ones, when I first started treaty work, they would send us to places. I went to, with the young people from Standing Rock, we went to Craven Canyon, and we had sweats there because of the uranium mining. That was our job, was to cause attention so they could stop the uranium mining. And then they sent us to Sheridan Lake, and we occupied Sheridan Lake there. And then from there, we went to Yellow Thunder Camp, and then we camped at Bear Butte also. So that was kind of my learning experience, a lot with just listening to treaty people and some of the traditional ways. Back then, the traditional elders were pretty strong. They were level-minded, they were kind. They used a lot of love too. They always would ask us if we're doing okay, did we need anything, how everything was going. For us, it was just fun because we were camped out and we were young people and we got to be together. So for them, it was work. Then I wanted to also mention, you know, I had the opportunity to spend some time with Claude Tuelk. The other day, we went to dinner and we were talking about how people think, and I'm a philosopher at heart. So I'm very concerned with the consciousness and how people think. And I remember reading a treaty of 1848, and it was probably one of the only treaties that had a narrative response from a tribal perspective, and it was Hopi Nation. And they talked about how the treaty was part of the prophecy that they had. Not that the treaty worked for them, that treaty hasn't worked for anybody, but what they spoke about was the four worlds. So they believed that, you know, we've lived through four worlds, we're in the fourth world, and each world was destroyed by a natural law. And the fourth world, it will be destroyed or challenged by the two-legged, the human intervention. But one of the things, you know, that always comes up was, how did the Hopis know that there were other worlds? You know, if that world was destroyed, you know, the people go with it. So in the language, they believe that our consciousness has no beginning and it has no end. That's how they know these things. They talk. We don't talk like that anymore, but we should. I think, you know, I've heard a lot of talk, mostly politics, and I think that's good too, but I also think that we're really going to survive on a spiritual level. I don't know how, I don't have that much hope, you know, for the material world, because it doesn't last forever. It's impermanent. Even if we got everything we wanted, it would still be an impermanent way. So I wanted to say that much before I get into my PowerPoint. I'm going to make my PowerPoint available to Phil Two Eagle, so anybody who wants a copy of it later can have a copy of it. And then I don't want to stress too much about the logistics of it. This presentation is just to give you like a preventative measure of what we're trying to do with these treaty laws. So I started out with the law called the Delegation of 1891. Everybody knows about the Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, and how this was supposed to be land that was to be absolute and undistributed use and occupation of the Black Hills of the Lakota Nation. And I think that whenever we talk about that, we need to keep emphasizing that to people that we talk to. We need to keep repeating the storyline over and over. So in the next one, most of you are probably familiar with this. The president's bipartisan infrastructure law made historic investment. As you know, President Biden put $28.1 billion and allocated that for the Department of Interior to restore critical habitats, address the drought crisis, reduce the risk of wildfires, and especially the one with extreme weather events. I know that there was a bad storm here last winter, and we lost some people in South Dakota due to that weather. And then if you look at some of the programs that are being introduced now with climate adaptation, climate change, all of that, this is part of where that money is coming from. And there are people who know how to write grants to get that money, but in order to spend it, they have to have Native people on their committee, or they have to be working with Native people. And I thought that that was important because part of that money was supposed to create good paying jobs in revitalizing local communities. And I was just talking to my friend earlier about how expensive everything is. You know, gas, room, everything you do costs a lot of money. And it was, you know, even to come here for a lot of people is expensive. And yet there's all these billions of dollars sitting somewhere to fix something that we probably won't even have any contact with in this lifetime, when the people need the money. It's the human beings that need the money, and they need the money now, not tomorrow or a program 6 months from now or 2 years from now. So we have to, there's a lot of rethinking with all of this that we have to do. And then if you look at the picture of the snow drifts, you know, and I quoted, Starr comes out when he said we were faced not only with blizzard conditions and extreme cold, but supplies were very limited. And part of that problem with supplies too is that they're very expensive. Even if you burn wood, maybe you get wood from the tribe and they haul it over to your house. When you run out of wood and you have to buy it, it's very expensive. And there's a wood shortage. So now we have more situations than we can handle, I think, right now. And then this one, in addition to the bipartisan infrastructure, the money there was the $32 billion for the American Rescue Plan. There's $13 billion bipartisan infrastructure that we talked about, and the $700 million Inflation Resolution Act. I don't know about inflation resolution. As far as I'm concerned, inflation is still there and it's getting worse every day, and everything seems to be more and more expensive. And then I wanted to go into, this is the part that I said was the structured part of this treaty conversation, is that treaty making is considered an agreement. And I know that a lot of people use abbreviations, they call them acronyms, and they'll say CDC or something. They expect that you know what they're talking about, but I think that it's easier to spell things out. And I think that agreements, all agreements that are made between Indigenous people, especially regarding the Black Hills, needs to have treaty language in it. And then I wanted to use another example that I heard on one of the webinars from Paula Antoine about a month and a half ago, and she was addressing, I think, the water in Nebraska. And she said, I'm not a lawyer, but I want to say this much. And, you know, really, there are very few lawyers among us. but that shouldn't stop us from saying what we need to say, because it's the government's responsibility to understand what we're saying. And we've been treating this the other way around. We've been trying to figure out what they're trying to say, but their language is very tricky and they change the rules on us all the time. So we're never going to catch up. So as long as we speak from the heart and as long as we try to get them to understand where we're coming from, our relationship to the land is more important. They will get it. They have to get it. And so we'll put this treaty language in everything that we write, and then use other bills that are relevant to making these treaty work, you know, like the Bradley bill. And then there's other acts that there were in place for Native people. And some of these treaties, they're not always just called a treaty. Some of them are called conventions, a protocol, a pact, an accord, etc. And it's the content of the agreement, not the name, that makes it a treaty. So when you write about the treaty, you include your people in there, you include your land base, you identify yourself spiritually. That's their responsibility to figure that out, not ours. But it's also our spirituality that makes us sovereign people. So also, you know, the issues to be considered in agreement, we all know that it's an implied contract. It's an offer, an acceptance, has considerations. There's also the purpose, the obligations, and the expiration or the exclusions that we want to include. I think, you know, because of this funding and how it's coming to the tribes, especially, you know, regarding the Black Hills, we always want to put the awardees in anything we write as agreements and treaties. So you always want to put Osheti Shakaway, or if it's specifically for a certain tribe, you always want to put their name in it, because then they can't backtrack on you. They can't change the dialogue later down the road. Put everything in there that you want them to understand up front first. Because it seems like we're always having to go back and amend something, redo something when that's not necessary. We really want to put in there the first time around what we really want and what we really expect to get out of this. And then there's also, you know, there's the written process, and then there's also statements that people make. And with every single thing that we do, we want to protect the tribal nation from future negotiations with intentions to extract, exploit, and diminish sovereignty. We don't just have to just see that as a concept. We can write that right into a treaty. That way they know that this isn't about giving up anything. This is really about taking back what already belongs to the people. And then we always want to communicate what risks and right there are involved with this kind of work. Talk to another person about the, you know, writing from a Lakota worldview is very important too. And there is, federal Indian law has the canon of Indian construction. And it's the responsibility of the government to understand how we're interpreting the law, not the other way around. So, and that's why that's really, really important. I don't see very many people utilizing that opportunity. These are opportunities to communicate in another way. So, and then I also wanted to mention about the memorandum of agreement and memorandum of understandings. They're not as binding as an agreement. Whenever the word agreement is used, it's treated like a treaty. So, and then there's constructed agreements. There's the tribal US codes. The only thing that's really important about this, I think, is that the actual construction of these type of agreements need approval of the secretary for any action of the tribe. So, and if, you know, we keep talking about how we're losing our sovereignty, you know, the federal government controls everything. And I think that we're all about not having that relationship. And the only thing that's preventing us from having that type of a relationship is money. If we had the money to walk away from the federal government today, we would do it. We could do it. But that's what ties us. And everybody needs to understand it's really not our way, but we don't have a choice in a lot of these things. And then this is what an arrangement looks like. And the question here is not so much as what is federal and tribal law, but it is moving forward writing specific articles of the treaty into tribal nations' federal interpretations, the literature, and the tribal law that will become necessary. So again, whenever you have the opportunity to write treaty language in there, write it in there. And then that way, again, like I said earlier, we don't have to keep backtracking. And then, as you know, in the last bullet point, many arrangements appear as MOUs. This one, I think this chart is really important. So I hope that if you want this PowerPoint, that you will get it from Phil, because there's a basis for comparison between an agreement and a memorandum of understanding. And I think the enforceability line is really important, because an agreement can be enforceable in the court of law. A memorandum of understanding cannot be enforceable in the court of law. And then the binding nature, an agreement is always binding in the parties to the agreement. And the memorandum of understanding, it is the binding upon the parties if the memorandum is signed in exchange for monetary consideration. Then there's collateral rights for both. The agreement has yes, they have collateral rights, and the memorandum of understanding doesn't. An agreement can be oral or written, and a memorandum of understanding has to be written. So then we talk about policymaking, which includes, the U.S. support for the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. I would encourage people to use that whenever they can as well, because we can make those mechanisms work, as we heard Andrea speak yesterday. And we just have to use it. I know a lot of people don't have experience, at that level, but we're not going to get experience unless we try. And it's okay if we make mistakes, because we have people who know this stuff real well, and they can correct us and they can help us make it work. So, and then I think Article 16, everybody was talking about PACTOLA yesterday, and that agreement with PACTOLA, this article from the 1868 treaty could be in there. That way the federal government knows the intention is to enforce those treaties. Other interesting thing, listening to Phil talk, is getting some housing there, to take care of that visitor center. I don't know how many of you know, but 9/10 of the law is occupation. You get your people to live there. If anything ever comes up, you end up in court, who owns what? The law is always going to lean toward the people who actually live there. So I wanted to say that much, because I think that's really important as well. And then here are where I got my resources. There's a lot of government resources in here. I don't know how interested you are in that, but I took some time to read through those. So I also wanted to add, some of the work that I do for the International Indian Treaty Council. I'm in a resource center room, and I read these treaties, and we file everything away. I look at a lot of negotiations, and I look at a lot of narratives that are written by tribes, and there's a lot of parallel across the tribes. Every single tribe has some conversation in there about genocide and land theft and mistreatment. So I think that those things are really important. If you ever get the chance to come to the International Treaty Office, I would advise you to come and look at those treaties. Can you hear me okay? You doing all right? All right, so I don't need to take any more time. I know yesterday we were really pressed for time, but I will answer any questions if anybody has any. Yep.
I just have a question. My name is Uma Wilkinson, and I just have a question that I don't know, maybe you could answer. A young woman got a hold of Ivan and talked about, or somebody, I think actually one of the clowns that was working on Crazy Horse and research, talked about going to Washington, D.C., and I think it was maybe in the Department of Interior or the State Department. They said in the basement of the State Department, there's a treaty that has a presidential seal on it, where Crazy Horse was given the Black Hills in a treaty. A treaty was made a long, long time ago, but that it's been hidden and it's not viewable. It's kept in a basement somewhere, and it's under a glass table, it's under glass. But the man that was able to see it, I believe, was one of the clowns who referenced it. And I'm just wondering, have you ever heard of that treaty or seen it? Or no, I guess it's not, I don't know if it's a treaty.
I heard of it a long time ago. Like when I said I first started out, I was really young and from the older treaty people.
Yeah.
But I do know from just working in the resource center at IITC that there are some treaties that are called what they call suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And when treaties are suppressed like that, that means that they're closed files. So I haven't seen it, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be another project, is to go after some of those things, write up a statement requesting, and base it on treaty rights and the UN and UNDRIP.
Which the tribes ought to do, their original treaties, yeah. Okay,
Good.
thank you.
I have a question, Vivian, or
Okay. Harold.
Dr. Wa'apiawi. The treaty she mentioned, the Crazy Horse was given a treaty territory by the Powder River in lieu of all the wars that was going on during the Red Cloud Wars. Also, the Teoshpais that signed the treaty, there's still a lot of descendants that are alive today. And those descendants should come forward and start representing their Teoshpais in that treaty process. The third comment or question is, how do we get our concerns and arguments to the United Nations, and who would they hear? I'm certain it may not be IRA, but who could approach and represent issues of these treaty degradations and violations that have occurred throughout time?
That's a good question. We have a special rapporteur for Indigenous people. His name is Francisco Cali. He's from Guatemala. And you would write a report to him. And he would read it, and then he would find the mechanisms to get it there. We also have Andrea Carmen, who does that work all the time. She works very closely with Francisco. So I think it's just doing it. I know in the beginning when UNDRIP was first being pushed through, everybody kept saying, well, UNDRIP doesn't have any teeth. We keep saying, go to the UN, use the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. But the teeth to UNDRIP and going to the UN is the people. If you have enough people supporting your report or what it is you're going after, that is the power. And you use your people to work with the International Treaty Council to get there. I had an idea. I think I could have been talking to Claude or maybe somebody else in here. I've been talking a lot of treaty stuff lately. And I thought, when the tribes like the Lakota Nation and the other Indian nations that have treaties, instead of going after these things to the federal government one by one, if we all pushed our treaty on the same day at the same time, the US government wouldn't know what to do.
Yeah, I went to my first treaty meeting in 74. The Institute for the Development of Indian Law put on a treaty seminar. Then again in 87, I went to a treaty conference in Roger Jourdain, Wendolen, Smith. They were all represented, and they all had the same position about treaty violations and concerns. And I have that information. I was looking at that, and you're right. I think there are a lot of treaty tribes that could present pretty much a collective argument that should be brought together under an organized approach. Question is, how do we get research done to make that happen?
Well, we have a resource center at the International Indian Treaty Office in Tucson, Arizona. That would be a good place to start, but there's also NARA, the National Administration Research, the National American Research Association, and it's in Colorado. They have copies of all the treaties as well. Another interesting thing too is they have one of the largest genealogical search engines in the world. So people trying to make ties with their ancestors and stuff in a documented way, they have all of that there too. Am I done?
Just a couple comments to follow up on what Vivian's saying. Two things. One of the things that I brought up yesterday, I didn't talk about it in much depth because we've talked about it here before, is the creation of a treaty registry at the United Nations. Our focus is the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. And they have agreed in principle already, which is, we've been working on this since, I don't know, the end of the 1990s with the first UN treaty study. But this would be a place that each indigenous nation or people could register their treaties from their point of view, as well as the oral histories, maps. We've already gotten this in there that it needs to be from the indigenous treaty nations point of view, not just what is seen as the English version of the treaty that the one treaty party drew up. And sometimes there's a huge difference between what our oral traditions say the treaty said and what the white man version that they drafted was, you know, especially in terms of land rights. So that's one thing that we're working on, and we're going to work on it in July when we go to Geneva, and we'll keep you posted on it, because that would be a place where there would be an official international registry of all of our treaties, whether they were ratified, whether they were not. We found out recently that, for example, in Guatemala, Spain made 60 nation-to-nation treaties with the Mayan peoples that when Guatemala became independent from Spain, they just didn't even recognize them. And our question is, what is Spain's obligation still to those treaties? So we're working on that as well, try to get, you know, there are a lot of treaty nations that we didn't even realize were treaty nations all over the world. So there is a bigger force than even we know about. The second question is who would represent the treaty at the United Nations? And that's a really important point. The UN is not going to decide who represents. They just don't, they wouldn't even do that. But we're working on something now that Bill Means has been talking about ever since I've known him for decades, about nations and governments and indigenous parliaments and traditional authorities, as we would call our traditional governments, going to the UN, not under the status we have now, which is non-governmental organizations, but as nations and peoples distinct from that. And we've made a lot of progress on that. I didn't talk again that much about that here this time, but maybe next time I could talk more about that. The Human Rights Council wants to implement it, and that's a body of 49 countries right under the General Assembly. So the question is going to be, who is going to represent the nation and the government if those seats open up for governments, you know, for representative institutions? And again, that's going to be something that the Ochete-Sacoan need to work out. You know, who is the representative of the government of each of the council fires? Because that's coming now. We're successful in getting those slots. Even we talked about just in last month in New York at the General Assembly. But who's going to fill those seats for your nations, your peoples? That's the question that is going to have to come to you all, each of us, as we talk about that. Thanks.
The reason I brought that up was, from what I've gained in my knowledge, there are 7 campfires in the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota. There are 7 councils. Because somebody's mic's on. So because of that, we went to Canada in 1990 and we signed a treaty of unification up there. And we had representatives from all the bands that signed on their behalf. And I have that list and I've shared it with the relatives up north. Could that be the organization that could be presented at the United Nations under treaty arguments and position statements and what have you? Question?
Well, I think that would be up to the Lakota Nation to decide. All of the bands, you know.
Okay, I have a copy of that registry. We called it a Treaty of Unification, and we had representatives that signed on to all them.
That's awesome.
And then we signed it. Then we signed a Treaty of Trade with the Chiapas through that process, and they agreed. Buffalo for coffee. So that's also an organic living document that we have.
Awesome.
Thank you.
I'd like to see that, Harold.
I'll get you a copy.
No, we're gonna take a break.
Oh, okay.
We're gonna have the singers sing a song, and I was gonna go back to the old boarding school days and put everybody together and go outside and we'll march around. I remember when I was going to school, when we fell asleep, they make us all line up and go outside and we formation, and they made us march around most of an hour and a half to wake us up. So I was thinking maybe you guys are old school. You march really well. Somebody sing cadence for you guys. All right. Oh, I also give a round of applause for Vivian, please. As far as every time I came here, she was always been here, very dedicated. So thank you, Wopila. So Nia. Okay, take a 5-minute break. Simon says.